Miscalculation by Spook in the Road. Alternate universe where Tom Riddle is a student in the 90s. Summary. Hermione Granger did not hate the head boy. She was just competitive, and Tom Riddle was the only student in the entire school who consistently edged her out of the top spot by a single point. Every damn year. Part 1. Hermione Granger did not hate the head boy. She was just competitive, and Tom Riddle was the only student in the entire school who consistently edged her out of the top spot by a single point. Every damn year. She knew that Professor Slughorn favored his Slytherins, and Tom in particular, and that was really the only reason she and Tom weren't tied for first place. And while some days she thought that maybe Tom might have deserved that extra point, his potions were flawless. She also knew that he gifted Professor Slughorn crystallized pineapple every Slug Club meeting. And wouldn't you know, crystallized pineapple happened to be a favorite of the potions professor. But aside from vaguely sucking up to professors, which Hermione was practically guilty of herself, Riddle had a spotless reputation. Slytherins were notoriously tight-lipped, and Riddle was so obviously their king, but even so, something should have slipped through. There was not one single rumor of him being intoxicated, despite the fact that Hermione had seen him drinking fire whiskey on numerous occasions at Professor Slughorn's insistence. No drunken mishaps. No wild parties in the dungeons. He wasn't a bully either, which made sense to some extent, because Hermione was sure that even with Riddle's perfect grades, Headmaster Dumbledore wouldn't have let him become head boy if he was some kind of delinquent. But again, Riddle hadn't had even one detention. He'd never been so much as rumored as to have said something insensitive or mean. Riddle didn't have a single messy breakup to his name either, though not for lack of partners. He was handsome and polite and took care in his self-image. So it was no surprise that he had great many admirers. But nobody ever dated Tom Riddle for very long, and Hermione was nearly positive that was Riddle's doing. So the logical conclusion was that he should have had at least a few scorned lovers. No such luck. Hermione didn't have any reason to think he was anything other than the perfect head boy that everyone else seemed content to adore. It was just a gut feeling, a little twist of her stomach every time the boy smiled that had nothing to do with butterflies. There was just something off about Riddle, and that was all Hermione knew. If the tall, dark-haired boy was at all aware of her suspicion, he certainly didn't show. Even now, as they were doing rounds, he was nothing but amicable. Hermione might have called him chatty even. And Professor Flitwick has asked us to help with the Halloween decorations again this year, Riddle said as they rounded the corner of the 4th floor. I'm afraid neither Belby nor Flint have much of the talent for such things. You remember the disaster last June, I'm sure, so I'm afraid we'll have to spearhead it ourselves. If I recall correctly, you're quite gifted at charms. Riddle flashed her one of his signature charming smiles, or as Lavender Brown had so delightfully put it, the panty-dropping grin. Hermione supposed it was aesthetically pleasing in an objective sort of way, but she didn't think it suited him. It was too wide, toothy, like he'd plucked it from someone else's face and made it his own. My parents would love to get a look at his teeth, she thought absently, forcing her own lips into a small lopsided smile. I'm adept enough for the task at hand, she replied dryly, though it's not exactly hard to beat Flint and Belby's work. Honestly, it was a terrible enough idea to transfigure Devil's Snare into mistletoe, but they could have at least asked someone competent to do it. Maybe then it wouldn't have tried to strangle the couples. Riddle hummed in agreement. Between the two of us, I'm sure we'll avoid any such mishaps. Hermione forced her smile to stay in place. To anyone else, it may have sounded like a compliment of her abilities. After all, who wouldn't want to be praised by the magical prodigy himself? But Hermione thought there was something else in his voice. Something almost threatening. As if he was warning her not to screw up. You're being ridiculous, she scolded herself. He's just worried about making sure his own reputation isn't tarnished by spotty work. You do the same. So instead of letting the comment drop, as the head boy had clearly meant for it to, Hermione waved her hand dismissively. "It's just decorations, Riddle," she said. "You could probably do them perfectly in your sleep." Riddle's lips quirked at the corners as he watched Hermione from the corner of his eye. For a moment, she thought he might say something more on the subject, but then they had rounded yet another corner where Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw were currently in the midst of an impassioned snogging session. Hermione felt her cheeks heat at the intimacy of the position, but Riddle merely cleared his throat, looking almost bored. "It's well after curfew," he drawled, startling the two students. They pulled apart from each other, trying to discreetly wipe saliva from their mouths. "Detention is in order. You'll each serve with your head of house on Friday evening." "Friday!" the Ravenclaw said incredulously, mouth opening again as if he was ready to launch a volley of complaints. "Yes, Friday," Hermione interrupted before the boy could even begin to try to dissuade them. "And next time you should think about if sneaking out after curfew is really worth losing your Friday evening." "Granger, if you take Miss Moore back to Hufflepuff, I'll escort Mr. Boot to Ravenclaw," Riddle said, "and we'll call it a night." Hermione nodded and watched as both Riddle and the Ravenclaw boy disappeared down the darkened hallway. She likely would have stood there for another minute if not for Miss Moore. Miranda, Hermione's mind supplied, did not start stomping off in the direction of Hufflepuff on her own. Hermione quickly trailed after the girl, but her thoughts were still annoyingly on Riddle. Hermione had always been bright and eager to prove her worth. 17 years of continuous bullying for her hair or her big front teeth, or her know-it-all attitude, or her bookishness had done very little to deter that. She'd gotten used to it, had learned to block out Draco Malfoy's whiny insults about her blood, Pansy Parkinson's nasally remarks about her lack of class. Hermione had figured out that they were jealous of her magical talent and intelligence, and so those kinds of comments hadn't bothered her since third year, when she had finally steeled her nerve and punched Malfoy in the nose. That had earned her detention, but it had been worth it. She had wrapped herself in knowledge with renewed vigor. She had practiced spells for hours, pored over every book she could get her hands on, because if they were going to be jealous and mean, then she would make herself untouchable. Because Draco or Pansy or Lavender Brown could be as snide as they wanted, but she was Hermione Granger, the brightest witch of her age. So she wasn't quite certain why it hurt so much to hear the just loud enough whispers in front of her in charms. "She just flails her hand around like a dying fish," one of the girls said, "as if that's attractive."
"Everyone knows the only reason she does it is for attention,"
the other said, turning her head slightly so that she could glance at Hermione from the corner of her eyes. Hermione kept her eyes glued on Flitwick and pretended not to notice.
"Because she thinks Riddle will notice her if she's as smart as him. She's been trying to snag him for years."
Hermione felt heat rise to her cheeks. People don't really think that, she told herself, do they? Her only interest in Tom Riddle was in crushing him academically. She didn't want to prove she was good enough for him. She wanted to prove that she was better than him. The first girl snorted a little too loud.
"Has she looked in the mirror lately?"
They snickered quietly, but Hermione's anger roiled in her stomach. Insults about her looks were hardly inventive or worth her time. But to think that people might assume she was only pretending to be smart to catch a man of all things. It was infuriating, insulting. Hermione felt a magic fizz around her, pulsing like a current through her veins in response to her emotions. It was almost too easy. They'd been practicing wandless and nonverbal magic this year, and though Hermione had difficulty with the more complicated spells, she could manage some of the basics, like Incendia, for example. It wasn't hard to act surprised, however, when the bright orange flames leapt up twice as high as Hermione expected on the robes of the girl in front of her. Those in the immediate vicinity shrieked and stumbled to get out of the way as the girl whose robes were currently on fire began tearing off her outer robes. Flitwick was quick to extinguish the flames, though not quick enough to keep the fire from singing off the bottom inch of the girl's hair. For her part, Hermione was careful to keep a neutral expression as the now hysterical girl was sent off to the hospital wing. She didn't know what had possessed her to actually light another student on fire, and in the middle of class where anyone could have seen. She had just been so angry, she'd barely thought about it. Stupid Hermione, she told herself. But then, no one seemed to be paying her any mind, and Flitwick was forced to continue the lesson after he realized that there seemed to be no way to prove what had happened. She did not notice the pair of dark eyes that stayed on her for the rest of class. Few people spent their Saturday afternoons in the library, especially when the weather was still pleasant, but Hermione, naturally, was an exception. She liked it best when it was quiet and mostly empty, and even the Ravenclaws usually had better things to do with their weekends than hole up with a dozen books in the back corner of the library. But Harry, Ron and Ginny were all at Quidditch practice, and Gryffindor Tower had little appeal without them. Besides, she had less than a year left to access the Hogwarts library, and she was going to make use of it. She had just sat down with a hefty tome on alchemy that was edited by none other than Nicholas Flamel himself, when a flash of movement in the restricted section caught her eyes. It seemed unlikely for anyone else to be in the library, and it could very well have been a trick of the light, but being head girl meant she was obligated to investigate regardless. She closed her book with a sigh and headed into the stacks. No sooner had she turned the corner did she see none other than Tom Riddle. She couldn't be certain, but she thought for a moment it had looked like he shoved a book into his bag. But that's ridiculous, Hermione told herself. He's Tom Riddle, head boy, and Slughorn's favorite. He could just check out any book from the restricted section that he wanted. There's no reason to sneak out anything. You're just being paranoid. He turned at hearing her footsteps. For a split second there was a strange look on his face that she couldn't quite identify, but it was gone in a flash, replaced by that damned smile. She forced her own smile. "I should have known it was you," she said with a shake of her head. "Who else would be in the library on a beautiful Saturday?" "You, apparently," he said with a knowing smirk. "Though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. It's only your diligence in studying that forces me to the library today." Somehow Hermione didn't think that was true. He probably didn't even have to crack open a textbook to keep up with her, the prat. And certainly his trip into the restricted section had little to do with their in-class competition. But fine, she'd let him pretend. "Someone has to keep you from getting too comfortable at the top," she said, only half-teasing. She didn't know how she thought he'd react, but it wasn't a sharp bark of laughter that tumbled out of his throat. It was so sudden that it seemed to shock even Riddle himself, and it lasted only for a moment before he reined in his humor. A smile still tugged at his lips. "It's a good thing you're around there, Miss Granger," he said, voice pleasantly low. "No one else would do half so good a job." It was then that she realized just how close they had gotten, though Hermione couldn't recall if she'd been the one to step closer or if he had. He was less than a pace away, leaning against the bookshelf and looking down at her with strange, unreadable expression. There was amusement there, but something else. Something unidentifiable that sent a shiver down her spine. Before Hermione could say anything else, a head of platinum blonde hair whipped around the corner in a blur. There was only one person in the entire school with hair that shade, and it was, unfortunately, the only person Hermione absolutely could not stand to be in the same room as. "Tom, there you are," Draco panted, looking as though he'd just run around half the school looking for the head boy. His eyes drifted over to Hermione, and his face immediately crumbled as if he'd just smelled 2-week-old garbage. "Granger, I have a pass, you know." Hermione resisted the urge to roll her eyes. "I never said you didn't, Malfoy." Draco continued to scowl at her until Riddle cleared his throat. "Did you need something?" Riddle asked. "Miss Granger and I were in the middle of a private conversation. It's rude to interrupt." A befuddled expression came over Draco's face, and he looked between Tom and Hermione as his brow wrinkled further. As if he couldn't fathom that the two of them had anything to discuss. Which was probably true, Hermione conceded, considering they hadn't really been talking about anything important. What did Riddle even talk about with his friends? They weren't really the studious type, and Riddle detested Quidditch. Probably politics and pure-blood family nonsense, Hermione concluded. You are said to come find you at 3 o'clock. Draco looked nervously at Tom. For the study session thing. And wasn't that interesting, Hermione thought. Draco had a lot of pride and arrogance, and for him to look at Tom as if the head boy had all the power in the situation, well, it had to mean something, didn't it? As far as Hermione knew, by her limited understanding of Slytherin politics, Draco should have been a higher rank than Riddle. Malfoy was the sole heir to an extremely prestigious and wealthy family, where Riddle had no familiar connections to speak of, and on top of that, he was a half-blood. And yet Draco deferred to Riddle. Why? Because he was head boy. Unlikely. Riddle smiled thinly at Draco, and the blond boy swallowed. Is it 3 already? I must have lost track of time. Miss Granger, until next time. He nodded his head at her, while Draco only continued to look on with something between confusion and disgust. Even after they'd gone, and Hermione had returned to her book, she couldn't shake the odd feeling that she was missing something. Something important. 6 years of being friends with Harry Potter and Ron Weasley had corrupted her. She knew it had. Because first year Hermione Granger would have never considered sneaking out after curfew without a good, solid reason. First year Hermione Granger would have been horrified to know that her older self was wandering the halls under a strong disillusionment charm on a night when she didn't have rounds just so she could spy on another student. Specifically, so she could spy on the head boy, who did have rounds tonight. She could not justify it. Tom Riddle had been nothing but polite to her. Complimentary. He was a model student, but she didn't trust him. No matter how she tried to tell herself she was being ridiculous, no matter how she tried to reason that she had no evidence to suggest that Riddle was up to anything at all, she couldn't shake her gut feeling. It wasn't hard to find Riddle. Hermione was familiar enough with rounds that she could guess where he'd be at this time of the night, and unsurprisingly, found him patrolling the halls of the second floor with 6-year Slytherin prefect Elias Avery. Getting close enough to listen to their conversation without being discovered was slightly harder, but nothing Hermione couldn't accomplish with a notice-me-not charm and silencing charms on her shoes. "Did you find it?" Avery asked. "The book, I mean." Tom shot the younger boy a dark look. "I know what you mean, Avery." He looked around the hall, making sure no one else was within earshot. Hermione held her breath, but Tom's eyes skimmed right over her. "And?" Avery asked impatiently. Riddle, too, had little patience for Avery. He stopped in his tracks and faced the boy coolly. Hermione could not recall a single instance when she had seen Riddle's face so devoid of emotion, so empty. There was none of his usual charm, none of the playfulness he'd shown her in the library. It was like looking into a still lake in the hopes of discovering something beneath the surface, but seeing only your own reflection instead. "I didn't realize I owed you a detailed explanation of my plans, Avery," Riddle said. On anyone else, the words might have come across as irritated, but Riddle's tone was casual. Hermione almost would have thought he was teasing his friend if she hadn't been able to see Riddle's face. His jaw was clenched, eyes dark and sharp. No, of course not," Avery stammered, clearly just as shaken as Hermione felt. "I would never presume, my lord." Hermione jolted at the title and frowned. Riddle isn't a lord, though, she thought. And maybe she was wrong. Riddle kept the details of his heritage closest to his chest. All she knew was that he was a half-blood and an orphan. But beyond that, hell, he could have been a long-lost descendant of the last Tsar of Russia, for all she knew. Still, it didn't sit right with her. First Draco's deference, then Avery's fear, and now with the use of a title. Avery was an heir to a lordship, in his own right, but everything about his behavior indicated that Riddle was his superior. Hermione couldn't account for it. Not that I know much about pure-blood politics, she thought. There were likely quite a few idiosyncrasies that she lacked the cultural understanding for. Riddle seemed satisfied with Avery's apology. His lips quirked up at the corners. Not quite a smile, but it was genuine nonetheless. Hermione was starting to wonder if this was his most genuine self after all. The fake smiles the polite prefect headboy act. What if it was just that, an act? And this empty, blank, terrifying nothingness was the real riddle. Or maybe he's just as fed up with Avery as you are, and his resting bitch face is better, she thought. Maybe you should stop looking for reasons to mistrust Riddle. Still, those thoughts didn't stop her from following them as they continued walking. To answer your question, Riddle drawled, seemingly back to his normal self. Mostly. Everything will be ready in time for Samhain. And is it everything you hoped for, my lord? Avery asked, practically bouncing on the balls of his feet. The younger boy, who had only a moment ago been all but cowering beneath Riddle's gaze, now was alight with barely restrained excitement. Whatever they were talking about, it was apparently highly anticipated. Riddle's smirk was sharp like a knife. It exceeds expectations. And just like that, the conversation was clearly over. Riddle had moved on to asking Avery about his arithmancy test scores, and Hermione decided that there was nothing more to be gained from following them. She returned to her own dorm, mind turning over everything that she'd heard. A book, Samhain, and something will be ready. The obvious answer was a ritual of some sort, but what kind she didn't know. And would Riddle really be stupid enough to do something like that on school grounds? Unless he's already planned for that, which of course he has, Hermione thought. So Riddle and his friends? Could she really call them that when it was becoming clear that Riddle was above them, were up to something? She had been right after all. All that was left was to find out what they were doing. To be continued. Thank you for listening to Miscalculation by Spork in the Road. Stay tuned for more spooky content.